Celia's life in Missouri began not with a name chosen in love, but with a purchase made in silence. She was still a teenager when she was brought across muddy roads and frozen fields to the farm of Robert Newsom, a widower whose reputation traveled ahead of him like a warning no one could speak aloud. Missouri in the early 1850s was a land balanced uneasily between frontier hope and brutal ownership, where the soil was rich, the winters were cruel, and human beings could be reduced to tools without consequence. Celia was brought to work, but from the very first night it became clear that her body was the real reason she had been brought there. Newsom did not wait for trust or consent or even familiarity. He took what he believed the law had already given him. In the dim light of oil lamps and the sharp smell of hay, Celia learned that slavery was not only chains and labor, but an endless violation that followed her even into the dark. Every night she waited for footsteps, for the sound of a door opening, for the certainty that sleep would never be safe. The barn became a place of dread long before it became a place of fire. It stood slightly apart from the house, a rough wooden structure that creaked in the wind, its walls soaked with years of animal sweat and damp straw. To the outside world it was ordinary, but to Celia it was a cage where time slowed and pain repeated itself without mercy. She was young, isolated and completely powerless, surrounded by a system that not only allowed her suffering, but denied it existed at all. There were no words she could use that the law would recognize, no scream loud enough to travel beyond the fields. Missouri nights were long, and silence was enforced not by walls but by fear. As months turned into years, the abuse did not lessen. Newsom's age did nothing to slow him, and Celia's growing despair did nothing to protect her. She learned to survive by becoming quiet, by folding herself inward, by counting breaths until it was over. The land around her moved through seasons as if nothing was wrong. Crops were planted, harvested, sold. Neighbors greeted one another. Children laughed in the distance. But for Celia, time was measured in visits to the barn and the slow erosion of her sense of self. She became pregnant, not once, but more than once, living proof of a crime that could never be named as such. Each pregnancy deepened her terror, because it meant the suffering was not confined to her alone anymore. It was passing into another life, one that would be born into the same cage. She begged Newsom to stop. It was the only request she ever dared to make. She did not ask for freedom or kindness or justice. She asked only to be left alone. Her plea was simple and desperate, but it meant nothing. In a world where she was considered property, her words were weightless. Newsom dismissed her fear as inconvenience, her humanity as defiance. He continued as before, assured by the law and by custom that nothing she did or said could matter. Around her, other enslaved people watched and understood, but they were trapped by the same invisible walls. Sympathy could exist, but help could not. Every path led back to punishment, to separation, to death. Celia began to understand something terrible and clarifying. No one was coming to save her. The realization settled slowly, like cold into bone. It changed the way she looked at the barn, at the tools hanging on its walls, at the firewood stacked nearby. She did not yet plan anything, but her mind started to move in directions she had never allowed before. Survival alone was no longer enough. The nights grew heavier as the year wore on, and winter approached with its biting winds and early darkness. The cold did not stop Newsom. If anything, it made him more insistent, more cruel. Celia's body ached constantly, and her spirit felt stretched thin, as if one more violation might tear her apart completely. She lived in a constant state of dread, waiting for the sound of his approach, for the summons she could not refuse. Each time she walked toward the barn, she felt as though she were walking toward her own erasure. The world narrowed to that path, that door, that place where her life was reduced to silence and submission. Yet somewhere deep inside, something stubborn remained alive. It was not hope in the gentle sense, but something darker and harder, a refusal to disappear quietly. She began to imagine an end to the nights, not through mercy but through force. These thoughts frightened her as much as they comforted her, because she knew the cost of acting would be unbearable. To resist meant death. To endure meant a slow destruction that felt worse than dying. The law offered her no protection, only punishment. The church offered prayers, not intervention. Society offered justification, not accountability. Celia stood alone at the center of a system designed to crush her, and the weight of it pressed down on her every waking moment. As New Year's approached, there was talk of beginnings and change among the free people, but for Celia, the calendar turning meant nothing. The nights were the same, the fear was the same. Yet something in her shifted as the year closed. The accumulation of pain reached a breaking point. She was no longer thinking about tomorrow or next week. She was thinking about that night, the next time he would come, the certainty of what awaited her if nothing changed. The barn loomed larger in her mind than ever before, no longer just a place of suffering, but a crossroads where her life might finally turn, one way or another. The darkness that surrounded her was no longer empty. It was heavy with unspoken resolve. She did not know exactly what she would do, only that she could not endure another night like all the others. In the silence before the new year, while the land lay frozen and still, Celia carried within her the quiet beginning of a decision that would soon ignite into something no one could ignore, a decision born not of rage alone, but of years of terror, humiliation, and a truth she had finally accepted. If the world refused to see her as human, she would be forced to make herself impossible to overlook, no matter the cost. The final night of the year arrived quietly, wrapped in cold so sharp it felt like it could split skin. Missouri lay frozen under a pale winter sky, the land stiff and silent as if holding its breath. For most people on the farm, New Year's Eve was just another night, marked perhaps by extra food or idle talk. But for Celia, it carried a suffocating weight. She woke that morning with a heaviness in her chest that did not lift as the day went on. Every sound felt louder, every shadow deeper. The routine of labor dragged her forward hour by hour, yet time moved strangely, stretching and tightening at once. She fed animals, carried water, and kept her eyes lowered, but her thoughts were fixed on what always came after dark. Newsom's behavior throughout the day was familiar in a way that made her stomach twist. He watched her with the same possessive calm, spoke little, and moved with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in his life. As evening approached, the temperature dropped further, and the air grew brittle. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the smell of burning wood drifted across the fields. The barn stood dark against the fading light, its outline sharp and unforgiving. Celia avoided looking at it, yet she felt drawn toward it all the same, as if some invisible force was pulling her closer to a fate she could no longer escape. Inside her, fear and resolve churned together until they were impossible to separate. She thought of the times she had begged him to stop, the way her voice had shaken, the way he had laughed or ignored her entirely. She thought of the pregnancies, of the terror of bringing a child into a world where suffering was inherited like property. None of it had mattered. Nothing she did had ever changed the outcome. As darkness settled, Newsom drank. The sound of the bottle, the smell of liquor on his breath, were signals Celia knew too well. Intoxication did not dull his intent, it sharpened it. Each swallow made the night more inevitable. Celia felt her pulse pounding in her ears, her body tense as if bracing for a blow that had not yet landed. When the summons came, it was unspoken but unmistakable. He moved toward the barn, and she followed, her feet heavy, her mind racing. The path was familiar, worn down by countless nights of forced obedience. Frost crunched beneath her shoes, loud in the stillness. The barn door creaked as it opened, the sound slicing through the quiet like a warning that came too late. Inside, the air was colder than she expected, the smell of hay and animals mixing with damp wood. Shadows clung to the corners, and the lantern light flickered, casting long, distorted shapes on the walls. Newsom's presence filled the space, oppressive and unavoidable. Celia stood rigid, every muscle tight, aware of her own breathing, aware of how small she felt in that moment. Yet something was different. The familiar terror was there, but beneath it ran a current of clarity she had never felt before. She was no longer simply enduring. She was watching, measuring, aware of her surroundings in a way that felt dangerous and deliberate. Newsom moved toward her, his movements unsteady but determined. He spoke words that blurred together, words she had heard too many times to count. The years of abuse seemed to press in on her all at once, memories overlapping until the present moment felt unbearable. She saw not just the man in front of her, but every night he had taken from her, every piece of herself she had been forced to give up. Her body reacted before her mind fully caught up. Her heart hammered so hard it hurt, and her hands trembled. She thought of what would happen if she did nothing, if she allowed this night to be like all the others. The thought felt like suffocation. Somewhere nearby was a heavy object, a tool left behind in the chaos of farm work. She had noticed it before, without understanding why. Now her eyes found it again, and the sight of it sent a jolt through her. This was the moment she had been moving toward, without admitting it to herself. There was no room left for hesitation. Newsom stepped closer, and the distance between them collapsed. In that instant, Celia acted. The motion was sudden, driven by a force that felt both foreign and inevitable. The impact was brutal and immediate. Newsom staggered, surprise flashing across his face before pain overtook it. The sound of his body hitting the ground was dull and final, echoing in the enclosed space. For a moment everything stopped. The barn seemed to hold its breath along with her. Celia stood frozen, staring down at him, her mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. This was not something she had imagined in detail, it was something she had reached when there were no other paths left. Fear surged through her, sharp and overwhelming. She knew what the law would do to her if she were discovered. She knew there was no justification that would save her, but alongside the fear was a strange, terrifying sense of relief. The immediate threat was gone. The man who had haunted her nights lay motionless at her feet. Panic followed quick. Lie. Her thoughts raced, colliding with one another. She could not stay, she could not leave things as they were. Every instinct told her to erase what had happened, to hide the truth in any way she could. Her eyes fell on the hay, the dry wood, the materials that surrounded her. Fire was always close on a farm, a necessary danger. She moved almost mechanically, driven by urgency and terror. The spark caught faster than she expected. Flames licked at the straw, small at first, then growing with alarming speed. Heat bloomed in the cold air, and smoke began to curl upward, thick and choking. Celia backed away as the fire took hold, her heart pounding, her ears ringing. The light from the flames cast wild shadows that danced across the walls, transforming the barn into something monstrous and alive. The smell of burning hay and wood filled her lungs, making her cough, but she did not stop. She knew she had only moments. As the fire spread, it consumed everything it touched, crackling and roaring as if fueled by more than just dry straw. Celia fled the barn, the night air hitting her like a slap. Behind her, the flames climbed higher, visible even from a distance, an unnatural brightness against the dark sky. She did not look back for long. She ran, driven by instinct, by fear, by the knowledge that there was no turning back now. The barn, once a place of endless suffering, was being erased in fire. The heat and light seemed to tear through the night, announcing what had happened even as she tried to escape it. Somewhere on the farm, dogs barked, disturbed by the noise and light. The fire crackled louder, the structure groaning as it began to collapse in on itself. Celia slowed only when she was hidden from view, her body shaking violently. She struggled to breathe, her chest tight with smoke and panic. The enormity of what she had done pressed down on her all at once. The was no joy, no triumph. There was only the terrifying awareness that her life had crossed a line from which there was no return. She listened to the sounds of the fire in the distance, each crack and collapse echoing in her mind. The new year approached, marked not by celebration but by destruction. As the flames consumed the barn, they carried with them the physical space where her suffering had taken place, but they also signaled the beginning of something far more dangerous. Celia knew that daylight would bring questions, suspicion, and consequences she could not escape. Yet as she stood there in the cold, trembling and exhausted, there was one undeniable truth she could not ignore. The night that had always ended in her violation had finally ended differently. The cost would be unimaginable, but the act itself was done, sealed by fire and darkness, as the old year died and a brutal new chapter of her life waited just beyond the burning horizon. Morning came slowly, as if the land itself hesitated to look at what the night had left behind. The fire had burned itself down to a blackened skeleton of beams and ash, still smoking faintly in the cold air. The smell lingered everywhere, heavy and unmistakable, clinging to clothing, to breath, to the ground itself. When the first people approached the barn site, they did so with confusion rather than alarm, expecting perhaps an accident, a careless lantern, a mishap common enough on farms where fire was always near. What they found instead did not fit easily into any ordinary explanation. The structure was nearly gone, collapsed inward, its shape distorted and unrecognizable. Beneath the ash and charred wood were fragments that made some of the men step back in uneasy silence. Bone, blackened and broken, lay mixed with the remains of farm tools and metal fittings warped by heat. It became clear quickly that this was no simple fire. Robert Newsom had not returned to the house that night, and now there was nowhere else he could be. The realization moved through the farm like a chill deeper than the winter air. Voices dropped, faces hardened. The question was not whether he was dead, but how he had died and who had been present when it happened. Celia went about her morning tasks as she always had, her movements subdued, her expression guarded. Inside, her body felt hollowed out, as if all the strength she had summoned the night before had been burned away with the barn. Every sound made her flinch. Every glance felt like an accusation. She knew discovery was inevitable. Fires left traces, and so did people. As the remains were examined more closely, the story of an accident became harder to sustain. The position of the bones, the absence of certain items, the unmistakable signs of violence beneath the fire's destruction all pointed to something deliberate. Word spread quickly beyond the farm. Neighbors arrived, drawn by curiosity and concern, and with them came suspicion. In a society built on hierarchy and control, disorder was unsettling, and violence against a slaveholder was unthinkable. Attention turned immediately to the enslaved people on the property. Their silence was interpreted not as fear but as guilt. Celia felt eyes on her constantly now, measuring her reactions, searching for cracks. She kept her gaze lowered, but her mind raced. She replayed the night over and over, each detail sharp and unforgiving. The sound of the blow, the way his body fell, the sudden terrifying brightness of the flames. There was no comfort in memory, only the relentless question of how long it would take before someone spoke her name aloud. It did not take long. Small inconsistencies were noticed. A missing object. Footprints in the frost that led where they should not have. Someone remembered. Seeing Celia moving late at night. Someone else remembered her fear, her avoidance of Newsom in the days before his death. None of these things proved anything on their own, but together they formed a shape that pointed in only one direction. When she was questioned, Celia's voice was quiet, controlled by an effort that cost her everything. She did not deny being there. She did not invent elaborate stories. She spoke simply, cautiously, aware that every word could be twisted into a noose. The men questioning her did not ask about her suffering. They did not ask what had driven her to that moment. Their concern was not motive but order, not truth but control. To them, the death of a white man demanded an explanation that preserved the structure of their world. A slave killing her owner could not be allowed to stand as anything other than a crime. Celia was taken into custody, removed from the familiar misery of the farm, and placed into a new kind of confinement. The walls were different, but the powerlessness felt the same. News of her arrest traveled quickly, carried by rumor and judgment. Some spoke of her as a monster, others as a warning. Few spoke of her as a human being. As the days passed, the reality of her situation settled in with crushing force. She knew the law. Everyone did. Missouri law did not recognize the right of an enslaved woman to defend herself against her owner. The concept itself was considered absurd. In the eyes of the court, she had destroyed property and murdered a man. The years of abuse she had endured were irrelevant, invisible, legally non-existent. Still, when she was finally brought before authorities, she spoke of what had been done to her. Not in dramatic language, not with accusations, but with plain statements of fact. She described the nights, the barn, the violations that had never ended. Her words hung in the air, uncomfortable, ND, unwelcome. Some listeners shifted, others stared past her, unwilling to acknowledge what her testimony implied about the society they lived in. Her confession was not met with understanding, it was met with resolve. The decision to prosecute was swift. Celia was charged with murder. As preparations for trial began, she was examined not as a victim but as a problem to be solved, a disruption to be contained. Even her pregnancy became part of the calculation, not as a reason for mercy but as a complication to be managed. There was a grim efficiency to the process, a sense that the outcome was already decided and the trial was merely a formality. Celia's days blurred together in confinement, marked by waiting and fear. At night, sleep came in fragments, haunted by memories of fire and footsteps. She wondered whether she should have done something differently, whether there had ever truly been another choice. Each time she reached that question, she arrived at the same answer. Endurance had not saved her. Silence had not protected her. The system had been perfectly content to let her suffer indefinitely. What she had done was unforgivable in the eyes of the law, but it was also the only act that had ever stopped the violence. This knowledge brought no peace, only a bitter clarity. As the trial approached, Celia became a symbol whether she wanted to or not. To some, she represented chaos, the danger of allowing enslaved people even the illusion of autonomy. To others, quieter and fewer, she represented a truth they preferred not to see, that the cruelty of slavery produced violence as surely as fire produced smoke. In the courtroom she stood small and restrained, surrounded by men who debated her fate in abstract terms. Arguments were made about property rights, about order, about precedent. Her humanity was acknowledged only insofar as it complicated the narrative. And her defense attempted to argue that she had acted in self-defense. The idea was dismissed outright. The law did not permit such a possibility. To allow it would be to admit that what had been done to her was wrong, and that admission threatened the foundations of the entire system. As witnesses spoke and evidence was presented, Celia listened, her face composed, her heart heavy. She recognized how little of herself was actually present in the proceedings. Her life had been reduced to an example, her suffering to an inconvenience. The fire that had destroyed the barn had illuminated something far larger and more dangerous than a single crime. It had exposed the violence at the heart of the world she lived in, a violence that now turned its full attention toward her. When the verdict came, it was not a surprise. Guilty. The word fell with a finality that echoed louder than the crack of flames. Sentencing followed, swift and severe. Death. The room remained calm, orderly, satisfied that justice had been done. Celia felt the weight of it settle over her, heavy but strangely distant. She had known this ending was possible from the moment the fire caught. What she had not known was how quiet the world would be afterward, how quickly it would move on. As she was led away, the image of the burning barn returned to her mind, not as terror this time, but as a marker. That place of suffering no longer existed. It had been reduced to ash, just as her old life had been reduced to memory. Ahead of her lay an ending she could not escape, but behind her lay a night when, for once, the violence had stopped on her terms. That knowledge did not absolve her, did not save her, but it remained hers alone, unburned and undeniable, as she stepped deeper into the shadow of a fate the world had already chosen for her. The days following the verdict unfolded with a slow, suffocating inevitab. Ility, as if time itself had decided to move carefully around Celia, stretching each hour to its limit. She was returned to confinement, a place colder and quieter than the barn had ever been, yet filled with a different kind of dread. The walls did not creak, and no footsteps approached in the night with familiar menace, but the silence carried the weight of finality. Outside, life continued with unsettling normalcy. Fields were tended, meals were cooked, conversations drifted from one subject to another. The death of Robert Newsom became a story told with certainty and judgment, stripped of complexity until it fit neatly into the belief that order had been restored. Celia's name was spoken less often as a person and more often as a cautionary tale. She was referred to as proof of what happened when boundaries were crossed, when the hierarchy that governed every aspect of life in Missouri was challenged. In confinement, she was visited by officials who spoke to her not with cruelty, but with indifference. They explained procedures, timelines, necessities, as if they were discussing the repair of a fence or the sale of livestock. Each explanation reminded her that she was still not being seen as a human being whose life had meaning beyond its end. Her pregnancy, now undeniable, drew attention and calculation rather than compassion. The state could not execute her immediately. The law required that the child be born first. This delay was framed as mercy, though it felt nothing like it. It meant more waiting, more nights alone with her thoughts, more time to understand the depth of what had been taken from her and what little remained. Celia spent long hours staring at the floor, tracing patterns in the dirt with her eyes, revisiting memories she had tried to bury. She remembered her arrival on the farm, the way the land had looked vast and unfamiliar, the way fear had settled into her chest even before she understood why. She remembered the first night in the barn, the shock of it, the confusion, the sense that something fundamental had been stolen before she had the language to name it. These memories came uninvited, vivid and relentless, yet they no longer carried the same sharp terror. That chapter of her life had ended in fire. The nights now were quiet, broken only by distant sounds of the town and the occasional footsteps of a guard. Sleep came in fragments, but when it came, it was not interrupted by violation. This absence was both relief and torment, a reminder of what peace might have looked like if it had ever been offered freely. Word of her case spread beyond the immediate area, stirring discomfort even among those who supported slavery. Not because they sympathized with Celia, but because her actions exposed a truth they preferred to ignore. The idea that an enslaved woman could be driven to such an act by sustained abuse unsettled the narrative of control and benevolence that many relied upon to justify the system. Some dismissed her claims outright, insisting she had fabricated them to excuse murder. Others acknowledged the abuse in private conversations, but insisted it changed nothing. To admit otherwise would have required a reckoning they were unwilling to face. In official records, her story was flattened into legal language: dates, charges, testimony, verdict. The lived reality of her suffering was reduced to background noise, something noted and then set aside. Celia herself became increasingly aware that her voice, once heard in the courtroom, had already been absorbed and neutralized. She had spoken the truth, but the truth had not mattered. This realization did not break her. It clarified something she had understood all along. The system had never been designed to hear her. Its purpose was to preserve its, no matter the cost. As her pregnancy progressed, her body became a site of contradiction. It was proof of the abuse she had endured, yet also a reason the state delayed her execution. She felt the child move and wondered what kind of world awaited it, knowing she would never be part of it. The thought brought waves of grief so intense they left her breathless. She did not know whether to hope for the child's survival or fear it. To survive meant being born into bondage, into a life shaped by the same forces that had destroyed hers. To die meant an end to suffering before it could begin, a mercy she herself had never been granted. These thoughts circled endlessly, offering no comfort. The people who interacted with her during this time treated her condition with procedural concern. They ensured she was fed enough to carry the child to term, not out of care, but obligation. Her life was being preserved temporarily for the sake of another, and even that preservation was transactional. Celia understood that once the child was born, her own death would be scheduled with the same efficiency that governed every other aspect of the process. This knowledge hung over her days like a shadow, shaping every moment. Yet within this grim waiting, something unexpected took root. Stripped of all illusions about rescue or justice, Celia found a strange, quiet steadiness. There was nothing left to bargain for, nothing left to fear beyond what was already certain. The terror that had once ruled her nights loosened its grip, replaced by a somber acceptance. She had done what she did to stop the violence, and it had worked. The cost was her life, but the exchange was complete. She was no longer living in anticipation of harm. The harm had ended. Visitors came occasionally, some out of obligation, some out of curiosity. A few asked questions, their tone cautious, as if approaching something. Dangerous. Celia answered when she felt able, always plainly. She did not embellish, did not seek sympathy. Her story was already what it was. Those who listened often left unsettled, not because they intended to change anything, but because her calm refusal to recant forced them to confront the reality they wished to deny. Still, nothing shifted. The machinery of punishment continued to turn. As the time of birth approached, preparations were made quietly, without ceremony. The child was born alive, a brief moment of fragile existence marked by cries that echoed against the same walls that had held Celia captive. She was allowed little time with the infant, just enough to know it was real, just enough for the bond to form, and then be severed. The child was taken away, its fate uncertain, absorbed into the same system that had shaped its mother's life. The separation cut deeper than any wound she had known. This loss was clean, final, and sanctioned. Afterward, the delay ended. The date of execution was set. The news was delivered without drama, as if confirming an appointment. Celia received it without visible reaction. There was nothing left to negotiate. In the days leading up to it, she reflected not on what she was losing, but on what had already been taken and what briefly she had reclaimed. The barn no longer existed. The nights of violation were over. These facts mattered to her in a way no verdict ever could. She did not see herself as a hero or a martyr. She saw herself as someone who had reached the limit of endurance and acted when no other option remained. The world would remember her differently, if it remembered her at all. That was beyond her control. As the final day approached, Missouri continued as it always had, unchanged and untroubled by the quiet ending of one enslaved woman's life. Celia moved through those last hours with a composure that surprised even herself. Fear visited her, but it no longer dominated her. She had already faced the worst the world had to offer and had survived it in the only way available to her. Whatever came next would be brief by comparison. In the stillness before the end, she held onto a single unyielding truth. The fire that had consumed the barn had also burned away her silence. Even if the law refused to acknowledge it, even if society erased her humanity in death as it had in life, the act itself remained. It stood as evidence of a reality too brutal to be contained forever. And as she waited, knowing the final step was near, Celia carried that knowledge with her, steady and unresolved, into the last darkness she would ever face. The final morning arrived without ceremony, marked only by the dull light filtering through a cold sky that offered no sign of mercy or judgment. Celia woke knowing there would be no postponement, no further delay justified by law or circumstance. The machinery that had paused only long enough to extract what it required from her body was ready to finish its work. She was prepared in silence, her movements guided by others who treated the moment as routine, an obligation fulfilled rather than a life ended. Outside, the town stirred as it always did. Shops opened, horses were hitched, conversations drifted toward ordinary concerns. The execution of an enslaved woman did not disrupt the rhythm of the day. When she was led out, the air was sharp, biting at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her attention had turned inward, focused on maintaining the calm that had carried her this far. Fear surfaced in brief flashes, instinctive and human, but it no longer controlled her. She had lived for years in a state of terror that demanded constant vigilance. Compared to that, this moment felt contained, finite. The crowd gathered at a distance, some out of curiosity, others out of a belief that witnessing punishment affirmed order. Few looked at her face for long. It was easier to see her as an object, an outcome, a necessary example. The officials spoke words she barely registered, formal language meant to close a case rather than address a person. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had driven her here. The law did not speak that language. As the final preparations were made, Celia's thoughts drifted not to the men around her, but to the barn as it had been before the fire, and then as it had been after, reduced to ash. She remembered the heat, the light, the sudden violent clarity of that night. For years the barn had been a place where time stopped and her will ceased to matter. Destroying it had not erased the past, but it had ended its power over her. That truth remained with her now, steady and grounding. When the moment came, it was swift. The world did not pause. There was no thunder, no sign that anything significant had occurred. A life ended quietly, efficiently, as intended. The crowd dispersed soon after, satisfied that justice had been served, order maintained. Celia's body was taken away, her existence reduced once more to a matter of procedure. Official records noted the date, the crime, the sentence. They did not record the years of abuse, the pleas that had gone unanswered, the system that had made violence inevitable. Those details lived only in memory and rumor, passed unevenly from one person to another, often altered to make them easier to dismiss. In the days that followed, the farm continued without its former owner. Property was reassigned. Labor resumed. The loss was discussed in terms of inconvenience and cost. Celia's name faded quickly from conversation, except when invoked as a warning. She became a story told to reinforce obedience, stripped of context until it served the PU. A pose of control. Yet the unease her case had stirred did not vanish entirely. It lingered beneath the surface, a quiet acknowledgement that something had gone wrong in a way that could not be fully explained away. Some people remembered the testimony she had given, the plainness of it, the way it refused to fit comfortably into the narratives they relied on. Others chose to forget or to reinterpret, insisting that she had been dangerous, unstable, anything but a person pushed beyond endurance. Time did its work, as it always does, smoothing sharp edges, burying uncomfortable truths beneath repetition and distance. Years passed. Laws changed slowly, unevenly. Slavery itself would one day be dismantled, though not before countless lives were broken by it. Celia's story did not become a rallying cry in her lifetime. It did not alter the course of events in any immediate way. Its power lay elsewhere, in what it revealed when examined closely. Historians would later uncover the records, the testimony, the cold language of the court that denied her the right to defend herself. They would note how the law had bent to protect property while refusing to recognize harm. They would argue over interpretation, motive, legacy. But even stripped of analysis, the core of her story remained stark and unavoidable. An enslaved woman was subjected to repeated sexual violence. She asked for it to stop. It did not. She acted to end it. The law responded not by acknowledging the violence done to her, but by punishing her for disrupting the system that allowed it. This sequence of events resisted simplification. It forced a confrontation with the reality that slavery was not only enforced labor, but total domination of the body and will. Celia's act did not exist in isolation. It was the logical outcome of a structure that offered no protection and no escape. Her death closed the case, but it did not resolve the questions it raised. In the quiet spaces between official history and lived experience, her story persisted. It surfaced in discussions about self-defense, about consent, about the limits of law when morality is subordinated to power. It complicated attempts to portray the past as orderly or benevolent. It reminded those willing to look closely that violence sanctioned by law does not cease to be violence. Celia did not leave behind letters or manifestos. She did not frame her actions in ideological terms. Her resistance was immediate, personal, born of necessity rather than theory. That simplicity made it harder to dismiss. There was no grand speech to undermine, no political affiliation to attack. There was only the record of what happened and the silence around why it was allowed to happen for so long. In this way, her absence spoke as loudly as her testimony had. The barn that once stood on the Missouri farm was never rebuilt in the same way. The land moved on, absorbed into new ownership, new uses. But the memory of that fire lingered, passed down as a cautionary tale, a curiosity, sometimes a scandal. Each retelling shifted slightly, emphasizing different details, omitting others. Yet the central fact remained: on a freezing New Year's night, an enslaved woman ended the abuse she had endured by destroying the place where it occurred, and the world responded by destroying her. This fact resisted erasure because it exposed the cost of maintaining an unjust order. Celia's life did not end in vindication or recognition. It ended as so many enslaved lives did, in punishment and silence. But silence is not the same as erasure. Over time, her story found its way back into the light, carried by those who understood its significance not as spectacle, but as testimony. It became part of a larger reckoning with the past, a reminder that history is only shaped by laws and leaders, but by the desperate choices of those denied every other option. Celia did not survive to see a world that acknowledged her humanity, but her story endured as evidence that such acknowledgement was necessary. In the end, what remained was not the fire, not the execution, not even the crime as defined by the court. What remained was the clarity of cause and effect, the undeniable link between sustained violence and inevitable resistance. Celia's life and death stood as a stark record of what happens when a system values property over people and order over justice. Long after the details blurred, that truth continued to burn, quieter than flames but harder to extinguish, demanding to be seen, remembered, and reckoned with, even when the world would rather look away.